review for The Elephant Man from 1980. One of the main podcasts I listen to is called Now Playing, and they do really good retrospective podcast reviews for movies. And so right now they're doing the works of David Lynch because they're coming out with rebooting the Twin Peaks series on Showtime, I believe. So they're going through his movies, which is nice because I'm a really big David Lynch fan. I've seen almost all of his movies. After seeing this, the two I haven't seen, and there's one called The Straight Story, not as well known. It's about a guy riding a lawnmower. And then Inland Empire is one of his newest ones. Those are the only two I haven't seen. And so this was, on my list of movies of his that I just hadn't seen yet. And so when they started doing this retrospective, I definitely wanted to watch it. It's very well known. Okay, I guess before that, this is his second feature-length film. He did Eraserhead before this in '77. It's very influential, very artistic, very experimental, but it got the attention of a lot of big directors in the late '70s. And then so this was 1980 that he started doing this. And so yeah, like I said, it was very well known because I think this was a really popular story at the time that they wanted to get directed, and it was actually produced by Mel Brooks, but he kept his name off of it because he knew that he was well known for comedies like Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein and stuff, and so he just kept his name off of it because he didn't want people to think it was a comedy. He did it with one other movie, I can't remember, drawing a blank on it now, but so he really got this going, Mel Brooks did, and brought David Lynch in to direct. And so everything that it was directed or nominated for, it didn't win any Oscars, but it was nominated for Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Director, Best Writing, Art Direction, Costume, Film Editing, and Music. So, the big awards, a very big deal. And because this is the story of the Elephant Man, the makeup is amazing, and a lot of people thought that this should have won an Oscar for the makeup effects, but it didn't. Before it would have had to have been like a special Oscar. They didn't have the set category for best makeup. But the following year, people think that this is one of the big reasons that the following year they did have the best makeup Oscar. And the following year it went to American Werewolf in London was the first one to win that Oscar. So it's a pretty big deal for that too. The makeup is really good. So this is based on a true story. It's a true story about a guy named John Merrick living in the 1800s, Victorian era in England, very disfigured, and was working in a sideshow, like a freak show, and then is found by this doctor, this surgeon, Frederick Treves, and then is brought to hospital where they can, kind of research him, try to find out what's wrong with him, and this never been seen before, anything like this. And so I'll talk about the movie, but in real life, his name was Joseph Merrick, and here he's called John Merrick. But in real life, this Joseph Merrick was not as abused as he is seen in the movie. He kind of knew what was going on and everything like that, and all things considered, considering what his condition was, he lived like an okay life. But here in the movie, we start out with finding John Merrick in a freak show. He's played by John Hurt. John Hurt already had a couple pretty big roles by this time. It was already an Alien and a couple other things. So he's playing John Merrick. He's heavily disfigured. He's in a freak show. And then so the surgeon, Frederick Treves, comes and sees him, and he's played by Anthony Hopkins. This is the earliest film of his that I've seen for Anthony Hopkins. He didn't have any, at least to my knowledge, any too big of roles yet. He would obviously later and win an Oscar for Silence of the Lambs, but this is a pretty early role for Hopkins. He's very good in this. And so he sees Merrick in this freak show, wants to bring him to the hospital to try to find out what's wrong with him. He's never seen anything like it. And people are still actually researching and studying his John Merrick's bones and stuff, and they think that there's like a couple deformities that he'd had, a couple diseases that made him have these very odd protrusions and growths, and he kind of has, growths all over that disformed him. But so yeah, he brings him back to the hospital. When he's there, they get to realize that he can actually speak, and before they just thought Treves thought he was just an imbecile, an idiot, or whatever is what they call him, and doesn't think that he really knows what's going on. He's like, well, thank God he doesn't because of his condition. But then they get to know he's there longer and he can talk, and they realize he's actually really well read. He like reads the Bible, and he, excuse me, he has all his knowledge and stuff, and so it becomes a pretty interesting story. He's pretty intelligent, and so when he's there in the hospital, like people start to come see him. There's an actress, Mrs. Kendall, that comes to see him after reading about him in the paper, and she's played by Anne Bancroft, and she comes to see him, and then like all these high society people start to come to visit him, and after that he gets kind of kidnapped again by the man that ran the freak show. Bites is his name, and gets kidnapped, and then eventually gets brought back. But it's kind of the story of he's just always being exploited throughout his life. He starts out as a freak show. People get paid. He's paying to see him and just look at him and stare at him. And then Anthony Hopkins' character Treves is kind of doing the same thing. He brings him into the hospital just to show other doctors and stuff what he found. That's an exploitation right there. And then after they start getting a lot of press, and he gets pretty famous in London and stuff, and like the Queen knows who he is and stuff like that, and then he's just getting exploited by the high society people that just come to see him, and you can tell they're not always super kind. They just want to do it because it's like the thing to do. And then there's like another side plot of when he gets kidnapped again or whatever. It's because there's a night watchman that's exploiting him as well, like letting people pay him, and then he'll take him to walk by his room and stuff. And so it's just kind of the whole thing just exploited the whole time, and it's you do feel like extremely sympathetic for him and really bad for him. And John Hurt, he's nominated for a best actor Oscar, and he does a really good job. It's pretty impressive, how much emotion and pathos he can kind of portray, especially through all the prosthetics. It's a really good performance. It is pretty emotional at certain times, and especially like when John Merrick gets to visit Treves in his home and meets his wife and stuff. That part's really good. They're pretty emotional. It's really well done. Really extremely well acted. Obviously a great movie. It's nominated for 8 Oscars. Because it's not always indicative of a super good movie, but very well done. It's interesting to be in black and white because obviously it's 1980. Didn't have to be in black and white for any reason. I think Raging Bull was also black and white at the same year, or very close. But David Lynch does an excellent job with it, and there's a lot of that industrial feel, industrialness to it, which you kind of get from Eraserhead. He kind of did the same thing. So there's lots of parallels between this and Eraserhead. I also thought of there's a TV show called The Nick with Clive Owen. Very similar. You get that Victorian industrial surgery setting and hospitals. It's very interesting. There's also kind of like the Phantom of the Opera type thing going on. The deformity and people kind of being creeped out by that and learning that's a real person. So those are some of the connections. For my rating, I'm going to give it a 3.5 out of 5. It's good. Definitely not a bad movie to watch. It's pretty interesting. Great performances. I like to see early Anthony Hopkins and John Hurt. Great makeup and everything. I think what I kept thinking is that if it wasn't a David Lynch film, I probably wouldn't have been very interested to see it. Which is kind of too bad, but I mean, you get that with certain directors, and his name brings a lot to it, especially looking back at his career, if you want to see all of his movies. So it's good. It's probably something I wouldn't watch again. I think I gave Eraserhead an even lower rating. I think maybe gave that like a 2.75 when I watched it, but I'd probably rewatch that before this just because that is even more experimental and kind of has more kind of elaborate, crazy stuff going on that probably be more interesting to delve into. And here it's a pretty straightforward story. Good, but not sure if I'd watch it again. So yeah, like I said, 3.5 out of 5. Good movie. Okay.